From neglected schoolboy with a lisp to the man who saved Western civilization, discover how Winston Churchill's lifelong hunger for approval transformed into the leadership that defeated Hitler. This is the ultimate story proving that our greatest weaknesses can become our most extraordinary strengths.
Narrative: Winston Churchill, the unlikely savior of civilization. In the dimly lit corridors of Harrow School, a red-haired boy with a pronounced lisp and a stutter sat alone in his dormitory, writing passionate letters to a mother who rarely replied, completely unaware that his feelings of abandonment and desperate hunger for approval would one day fuel the oratory that would rally the free world against fascism and save Western civilization from its darkest threat. This wasn't just any privileged but troubled aristocratic child. This was Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, whose journey from neglected schoolboy to rejected politician to history's most unlikely savior would span nearly a century and prove that sometimes our greatest weaknesses become our most extraordinary strengths. Born on November 30, 1874, at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, Winston entered the world 2 months prematurely during a dance, an appropriately dramatic beginning for someone whose entire life would be marked by crisis, controversy, and the kind of larger-than-life episodes that seem too incredible for fiction. His birth at the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Marlborough immediately placed him within Britain's highest aristocratic circles, yet the circumstances of his childhood would make him feel like an perpetual outsider seeking acceptance and validation through increasingly audacious acts of courage and defiance. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was one of the most brilliant and erratic politicians of the Victorian era, a rising conservative star whose meteoric career was matched only by his spectacular fall from grace due to illness, possibly syphilis, that would gradually destroy his mind and personality. Lord Randolph's relationship with his eldest son was characterized by alternating indifference and harsh criticism, creating in Winston a lifelong hunger for paternal approval that would drive him to extraordinary achievements while leaving psychological wounds that never fully healed. His mother, Jenny Jerome Churchill, was an American heiress whose beauty, intelligence, and social ambition had captivated London society, but whose maternal instincts were limited by the conventions of aristocratic child-rearing and her own desires for social conquest and romantic adventure. Jenny's numerous affairs and constant social obligations left little time for nurturing her children, creating in Winston a desperate need for attention that would manifest throughout his life as an almost compulsive drive to be the center of every conversation, every room, and eventually every major historical moment. The nursery at Blenheim Palace, presided over by Mrs. Elizabeth Everest, became Winston's true emotional home during his early years. Mrs. Everest, whom Winston called Womb, provided the unconditional love and consistent care that his parents could not offer, becoming the most important relationship of his childhood and the template for the fierce loyalty he would later inspire in those who served under his leadership. Her death in 1895 devastated Winston, who rushed to her deathbed and later described losing her as one of the most profound griefs of his entire life. His education at Harrow School was marked by academic mediocrity disguised by flashes of brilliance in subjects that captured his imagination. Winston's mind was too restless and creative for the rigid classical curriculum, but his phenomenal memory allowed him to excel in history and English, while his natural rebelliousness made him a constant source of frustration for his teachers. His famous poor performance in Latin and Greek masked a voracious appetite for literature, adventure stories, and military history that was already shaping his romantic vision of heroism and imperial destiny. The incident that defined his Harrow years occurred when Winston pushed another boy, Leo Amory, into the swimming pool at the school's bathing lake. When Amory emerged sputtering and announced his identity as a senior boy, Winston's response became legendary: "I am very sorry. I mistook you for a fourth former. You are so small." This combination of supreme confidence, quick wit, and complete inability to back down in the face of authority would characterize his entire approach to life and politics. His academic struggles at Harrow created constant tension with his father, whose disappointment in Winston's performance reinforced the boy's sense of inadequacy while simultaneously fueling his determination to prove his worth through increasingly dramatic gestures. The decision to pursue a military career at Sandhurst was seen by Lord Randolph as acknowledgement of his son's intellectual limitations, but for Winston it represented an opportunity to achieve the glory and recognition that had eluded him in the classroom. The 3 years at the Royal Military College Sandhurst transformed Winston from an undisciplined schoolboy into a competent cavalry officer, though his instructors noted his tendency to question orders and his apparent belief that rules applied differently to him than to other cadets. His fascination with military history, strategy, and the romantic ideals of cavalry warfare prepared him for the adventurous career he craved, while also beginning to develop the strategic thinking that would later make him one of history's great war leaders. His commission as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars in 1895 should have marked the beginning of a conventional military career, but Winston's restless ambition and his need for both action and recognition drove him to seek active service in every available conflict. His philosophy was simple: where there was fighting, there was opportunity for advancement, fame, and the kind of heroic exploits that would force the world to recognize his exceptional qualities. His first taste of combat came in Cuba in 1895, where he served as a correspondent covering the Spanish efforts to suppress Cuban independence. This dual role as soldier and journalist, which he would repeat throughout his early career, demonstrated his understanding that modern warfare required not just military victory but also the ability to shape public opinion through compelling narrative. His dispatches from Cuba showed an early mastery of the dramatic prose style that would later make his speeches so memorable and effective. The Northwest Frontier Campaign in India in 1897 provided Winston with his first experience of genuine combat and his initial recognition as both a military officer and a war correspondent. His book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, established him as a writer capable of transforming military campaigns into compelling adventure narratives, while also beginning his lifelong practice of positioning himself at the center of every story he told. The book's success gave him confidence in his literary abilities and provided crucial income for maintaining the expensive lifestyle he considered essential to his social position. The Sudan campaign of 1898, culminating in the Battle of Andaman, became the defining military experience of Winston's youth and the source of some of his most vivid and controversial writing. His participation in one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history satisfied his romantic notions of warfare, while his book The River War demonstrated his ability to combine thrilling narrative with serious analysis of military strategy and imperial policy. The controversy surrounding his criticism of General Kitchener's treatment of wounded enemy soldiers showed his willingness to challenge authority even when it risked his military career. His capture and dramatic escape during the Second Boer War in 1899 to 1900 transformed Winston from a promising young officer into a genuine celebrity, with his 300-mile journey through enemy territory becoming the stuff of legend and providing him with the public recognition he had always craved. The escape story, endlessly retold and embellished over the years, demonstrated his physical courage, quick thinking, and extraordinary luck, while also revealing his instinctive understanding of how to transform personal experience into political capital. The transition from military service to politics in 1900, when Winston was elected Conservative MP for Oldham, represented the fulfillment of ambitions that had been building since his Harrow years. His maiden speech in Parliament, delivered with the same confidence he had shown when pushing Leo Amory into the swimming pool, established him as a formidable orator despite his lisp and occasional stutter. His ability to command attention through the sheer force of personality and the brilliance of his rhetoric would become his most powerful political weapon. His dramatic defection from the Conservative Party to the Liberals in 1904, ostensibly over free trade but also motivated by his belief that the Liberal Party offered better opportunities for rapid advancement, demonstrated both his political flexibility and his supreme confidence in his own abilities. The move, which his former Conservative colleagues saw as treacherous opportunism, reflected Winston's lifelong conviction that principles mattered less than positioning oneself to achieve great things for the nation and for history. As a Liberal cabinet minister under Campbell Bannerman and Asquith, Winston championed progressive social reforms that seemed to contradict his aristocratic background but actually reflected his romantic belief in the nobility of protecting the weak and improving the lot of ordinary people. His work on unemployment insurance, labor exchanges, and prison reform showed his capacity for detailed administrative work, while his speeches on these issues revealed his ability to elevate mundane policy questions into matters of moral urgency and national destiny. His appointment as First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, at the age of just 36, placed him in charge of the Royal Navy at the moment when naval supremacy was becoming crucial to Britain's survival in an increasingly dangerous world. His energy, vision, and willingness to embrace technological innovation transformed the Navy, while his dramatic personality and hands-on management style created both fierce loyalty among some officers and bitter resentment among others who found his interference insufferable. The development of naval aviation, the conversion from coal to oil, and the construction of the revolutionary HMS Dreadnought battleships under Winston's leadership demonstrated his ability to recognize and promote Technological advancement. While his establishment of the Royal Naval Air Service showed his understanding that future wars would be won through innovation rather than tradition. His famous declaration that the traditions of the Navy were rum, sodomy, and the lash captured both his irreverent attitude toward established institutions and his determination to modernize Britain's military forces. World War I brought Winston both his greatest early triumph and his most devastating failure, establishing patterns of brilliant strategic insight combined with questionable judgment that would characterize his entire career. His mobilization of the fleet in 1914, accomplished through a series of decisions that bordered on insubordination but proved crucial to Britain's early war efforts, demonstrated his willingness to take enormous personal risks when he believed the national interest was at stake. The Dardanelles campaign of 1915, Winston's attempt to knock Turkey out of the war and open a new front against Germany, represented both his strategic brilliance and his fatal tendency to become so convinced of his own ideas that he ignored practical objections and mounting evidence of failure. The campaign's catastrophic failure, costing hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties, destroyed Winston's reputation and forced his resignation from the Admiralty, marking the first time his confidence and ambition had led to genuine disaster. His brief service as a battalion commander on the Western Front in 1916, commanding the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers in the trenches, provided him with first-hand experience of the war's brutal reality while also demonstrating his physical courage and his ability to win the loyalty of ordinary soldiers through shared hardship and genuine concern for their welfare. The experience of commanding men in combat, watching them die, and learning to make life-and-death decisions under extreme stress prepared him for the even greater responsibilities he would later bear. The interwar years saw Winston's return to the Conservative Party and his service as Chancellor of the Exchequer under Baldwin, but also marked the beginning of his decade-long political isolation as his views on India, rearmament, and the growing threat of Nazi Germany put him at odds with the prevailing political consensus. His opposition to Indian independence, while reflecting outdated imperial attitudes, also demonstrated his consistent belief that Britain had moral obligations that transcended immediate political convenience. His warnings about the rise of Adolf Hitler, beginning as early as 1933 and continuing throughout the decade of appeasement, established him as a prophet whose accuracy was matched only by his political isolation. His speeches about German rearmament, delivered to largely empty Houses of Commons, combined detailed intelligence analysis with prophetic rhetoric that would later seem uncannily prescient but at the time appeared to be the ravings of a warmongering has-been seeking relevance through alarmism. The years in the wilderness, roughly from 1929 to 1939, were perhaps the most crucial in Winston's development as a leader and thinker. His massive biography of his ancestor the Duke of Marlborough allowed him to study military leadership and grand strategy in unprecedented detail, while his history of the English-speaking peoples forced him to grapple with the long arc of democratic development and the special relationship between Britain and America that would prove crucial during World War II. His literary work during this period, including articles, speeches, and books that generated the income necessary to maintain Chartwell, his beloved country house in Kent, showed his evolution from a talented amateur historian into a serious scholar of war and politics. His writing revealed an increasingly sophisticated understanding of the forces that shape history while also demonstrating his lifelong conviction that individual leaders could alter the course of events through force of will and clarity of vision. The financial pressures that nearly bankrupted him during these years, caused by his expensive lifestyle and his disastrous investment in American stocks just before the 1929 crash, taught him about the vulnerability of even privileged individuals to economic forces beyond their control. This experience of near financial ruin provided him with unexpected insight into the struggles of ordinary people while also reinforcing his determination never again to be dependent on others for his basic security. His relationship with Clementine Hosier, whom he married in 1908, provided the emotional stability and practical support that allowed him to survive his political failures and personal disasters while pursuing his increasingly expensive and time-consuming historical and literary projects. Clementine's intelligence, judgment, and absolute loyalty became crucial elements in Winston's eventual success, though their marriage was tested by his demanding career, his black moods, and his tendency to subordinate everything to his political and literary ambitions. The declaration of war in September 1939 marked Winston's return to the Admiralty and his emergence from the wilderness, but his appointment as First Lord was greeted with mixed feelings by colleagues who remembered the Dardanelles disaster and worried about his judgment and stability. The signal sent to the fleet, "Winston is back," reflected both the Navy's affection for his earlier service and the uncertainty about whether his return represented salvation or potential catastrophe. The Norway campaign in April 1940, another strategic failure that nevertheless led to Winston's elevation to Prime Minister, demonstrated both his persistent tendency toward risky operations and the political luck that seemed to protect him from the consequences of his mistakes. The parliamentary debate that brought down Neville Chamberlain also established Winston as the only Conservative leader capable of forming a national coalition government in Britain's hour of maximum peril. His appointment as Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, the same day that Hitler launched his offensive against France and the Low Countries, placed him in power at the moment of Britain's greatest danger since the Norman Conquest. His first speech to Parliament as Prime Minister, promising blood, toil, tears, and sweat, established the tone of uncompromising resistance that would characterize his wartime leadership while also acknowledging the enormous sacrifices that victory would require. The Battle of France and the evacuation from Dunkirk in May and June 1940 tested both Winston's strategic judgment and his ability to maintain public morale in the face of catastrophic military defeat. His speeches during this period, particularly his declaration that Britain would fight on whatever the cost may be, transformed military disaster into moral triumph while establishing him as the voice of democratic resistance to totalitarian aggression. The summer of 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany while facing the imminent threat of invasion, represented both the greatest test of Winston's leadership and his supreme moment of historical vindication. His refusal to consider peace negotiations with Hitler, despite pressure from some cabinet colleagues and the apparently hopeless military situation, demonstrated the moral courage and strategic vision that had been building throughout his long and controversial career. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over southern England between July and October 1940, became the first major Allied victory of World War II and validated Winston's decision to fight on regardless of the odds. His famous tribute to the RAF pilots, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, captured both the magnitude of their achievement and his own gift for finding words that would resonate through history. The Blitz, the German bombing campaign against British cities that began in September 1940, provided Winston with opportunities to demonstrate the personal courage and connection with ordinary people that had been developing since his days as a young cavalry officer. His walks through bombed neighborhoods, his appearances in air raid shelters, and his visible sharing of the dangers faced by civilians created a bond between leader and people that sustained British morale through the war's darkest periods. His relationship with Franklin Roosevelt, developed through their Atlantic Charter meeting in August 1941 and sustained through constant correspondence, demonstrated his understanding that Britain's survival ultimately depended on American entry into the war. His cultivation of American public opinion through speeches, visits, and his mother's American connection showed his early recognition that modern warfare required not just military strategy but also diplomatic and propaganda campaigns designed to shape global opinion. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which brought America fully into the war, fulfilled Winston's long-held belief that the English-speaking peoples would ultimately unite to defend democratic civilization against totalitarian threats. His immediate trip to Washington to meet with Roosevelt demonstrated both his understanding of the war's global dimensions and his determination to ensure that Britain remained a major partner in the alliance rather than a junior client state. The Grand Alliance with the Soviet Union, forged despite Winston's lifelong hatred of communism and his accurate prediction of post-war Soviet behavior, showed his ability to subordinate personal and ideological preferences to the requirements of victory. His famous declaration that if Hitler invaded hell he would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons captured both his pragmatism and his understanding that defeating Nazi Germany required cooperation with Stalin regardless of the long-term consequences. The strategic debates over the Second Front, the Mediterranean campaign, and the eventual D-Day invasion revealed both Winston's strategic brilliance and his increasing marginalization as American resources and manpower began to dominate Allied planning. His preference for indirect approaches through the Balkans and Italy, while militarily questionable, reflected his understanding of the political implications of military campaigns and his concern about post-war Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe. His famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946, delivered less than a year after the war's end, demonstrated his prescient understanding of Soviet intentions and his ability to articulate the challenges facing the Western democracies in the emerging Cold War. The speech's initial negative reception, particularly from American politicians eager to believe in post-war cooperation with Stalin, showed Winston's willingness to tell uncomfortable truths even when they contradicted popular hopes and expectations. His defeat in the 1945 general election, coming just 2 months after Germany's surrender, was perhaps the most devastating personal blow of his entire career, as British voters rejected the man who had saved them from Nazi tyranny in favor of Clement Attlee's promise of social reconstruction and welfare state benefits. His wife's suggestion that the defeat might be a blessing in disguise prompted his famous reply, "If it is very well disguised indeed." The 6 years in opposition, from 1945 to 1951, allowed Winston to focus on his historical writing while also developing his thoughts about European unity, the special relationship with America, and the challenges posed by nuclear weapons and Soviet expansionism. His advocacy for European integration, while excluding Britain from full participation, reflected his understanding of the need for Western unity while also demonstrating the persistent imperial mentality that limited his vision of Britain's post-war role. His return to Downing Street as Prime Minister in 1951, at the age of 76, represented both a personal triumph and the beginning of a gradual decline that would force him to confront his own mortality and the limits of his legendary energy and determination. His efforts to maintain Britain's global influence while managing imperial retreat and economic decline showed both his persistent belief in British greatness and his growing recognition that the world had changed irrevocably. The decision to develop an independent British nuclear deterrent, pursued despite American opposition and enormous financial costs, reflected Winston's determination to maintain Britain's position as a major power while also demonstrating his understanding of nuclear weapons' revolutionary impact on international relations. His famous phrase about the balance of terror showed his grasp of nuclear strategy's paradoxical logic, while his advocacy for summit diplomacy revealed his persistent belief that personal relationships between leaders could resolve international conflicts. His final years in office, marked by increasing health problems and occasional confusion, created difficult situations for colleagues who revered his wartime leadership but worried about his declining abilities and his reluctance to acknowledge the need for retirement. His stroke in 1953, kept secret from the public, forced him to confront his physical limitations while also demonstrating the loyalty of subordinates who protected him even when his condition compromised government effectiveness. His retirement in 1955, finally forced by his recognition that he could no longer fulfill his duties effectively, marked the end of one of the longest and most eventful political careers in British history. His farewell speech to the House of Commons, delivered without notes despite his age and health problems, reminded his audience of the principles that had guided his career while also acknowledging the uncertainty of the future that younger leaders would inherit. The final decade of his life, from 1955 to 1965, saw Winston's transformation from active politician to revered elder statesman and living symbol of Britain's finest hour. His continued writing, including the completion of his History of the English-Speaking Peoples, showed his persistent intellectual curiosity, while his public appearances at state occasions demonstrated the affection and respect that his wartime leadership had earned from people around the world. His state funeral in January 1965, attended by representatives from 112 nations and watched by an estimated 350 million television viewers worldwide, represented not just tribute to an individual leader but recognition of his unique role in preserving democratic civilization during its greatest crisis. The ceremony's combination of military pomp and genuine popular mourning showed how completely he had transcended party politics to become a symbol of courage, determination, and the democratic values he had defended throughout his career. The debate over Winston's legacy, including controversies about his imperial attitudes, his role in various military disasters, and his sometimes questionable judgment, reflects the complexity of a career that spanned nearly 7 decades and touched virtually every major issue in modern British and world history. His flaws and failures were as spectacular as his triumphs, but his ultimate vindication came through his leadership during World War II and his prescient warnings about both Nazi Germany and Soviet communism. His influence on modern political leadership, particularly the understanding that democratic leaders must be able to inspire through rhetoric while also making difficult decisions based on long-term rather than short-term considerations, continues shaping how we think about the relationship between individual character and historical outcomes. His example suggests that leadership in democratic societies requires not just political skill but also moral courage and the willingness to accept unpopularity when principles are at stake. Today, Winston Churchill remains the standard by which wartime leadership is measured, while his writings continue providing insight into the challenges facing democratic societies in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. From the neglected schoolboy at Harrow to the savior of Western civilization, his journey proves that individual character, properly developed and courageously applied, can indeed alter the course of human history in ways that benefit all mankind. His story reminds us that the greatest leaders are often those who overcome personal weaknesses and early failures through persistent effort and unwavering commitment to principles larger than themselves. The boy who desperately sought his parents' approval ultimately won the approval of history itself, while the young man who seemed destined for mediocrity or disaster became one of the towering figures of the modern age through his refusal to accept defeat and his absolute conviction that good would ultimately triumph over evil.
Churchill proved that persistence, courage, and unwavering principles can change the world. From failure to triumph, he showed us that true leadership means standing firm when others falter. Subscribe for more incredible leadership stories. Like if Churchill inspires you, share your thoughts on courage.